Good evening. I will try to be brief because I talk straight to the point. As I was told, Tebogo, I worked with Paul and 2610 South. I'm a lecturer right now at the University of Johannesburg. And my project looks at Migrant City, looking at the architecture of migrancy for women and children, because there's a notion of occupying memory where the tradition of migration still perpetuates in Johannesburg, and there's a need for housing for it. But as a migrant, you don't have rights in a country that you migrate to if you don't have a passport or a form of identification. So we have a lot of migrants left in marginalized communities, and they occupy the space in a way that is informal, and it sort of pushes them into an environment which makes them participate in informal economies. So the culture and memory of migration has happened from the colonial past, and it's still happening right now, because cities, it's where everyone gets attracted. And the project was looking at how Johannesburg is formed, like as Paul has stated, about you have this fortified city. So this city is actually designed in a very genius way that even the growth of it becomes difficult, where you have a highway. It's a highway fortifying the inner core, and then everybody has to fight for occupying the space on the edges and right on the inside, at certain points on the inside. So you have migrant women and children waiting or looking, begging on the streets of Johannesburg, and this is the issues that we have at the moment. And everyone is aspiring for a better life when they arrive in the city. So the project, the way I looked at it, it was very interesting. It was looking at the journey of the woman and child and how they actually traverse through different continents trying to make their way to Johannesburg, and how that creates a multiplication of cities within them. So they have this narrative of every different city that they have traveled across. Oops, what did I do? So the story looks at a shelter in Johannesburg where the woman and child, they arrive. If they don't get any information, then they're left in a space where they have to find some sort of occupation, most of the time which is the street. And then the churches, the Catholic churches are the ones normally that help the migrant and child find some form of refuge within the city. And they get into a refuge shelter where they'll stay for a period of 0 to 6 months or a year. So the project is situated in Bedrooms on the east of Johannesburg city center, and this is the focus study, which is in pink, and this is the shelter. It looks like a normal flat, but what happens is that the woman and child get admitted into the building, and then they stay there for a period of time, and then they have to leave. They either find some sort of temporary citizenship, or they will have to leave the city and find some other means of survival. So this is the original shelter, and then this is the typology. It's 60% coverage. But right now, the shelter houses about 52 women and children combined, and it's transitional housing in a way, because they occupy each and every corner and space of the building. And these diagrams was to map the memory and map the movement within the building and look at how these different programs. So they don't have a specific program for every room. Every room keeps changing every 24 hours to allow for these activities to happen. And these are the spaces. This becomes a daycare center, but on a weekend it becomes a church. And this is like the place to eat. And this is the big dining hall, and everyone squeezes in that space. And there's also some form of recreational, where the women will have sewing classes to make bags and clothing and fabric. And every day there's always laundry. There's always washing, because you have the kids, which is a very interesting activity to map as well. And we have issues with the mayors in the city where they're actually calling migrants illegal and they're calling them criminals. So this is the sort of conditions that we're living in, and the political. So it's not just I think I've been hearing about Sao Paulo and the political climate. Even Johannesburg at certain points is facing these conditions. And as I studied the Constitution and the Human Bill of Rights, it says every human being has a right to equality, education, dignity, safety, shelter, and healthcare. So this is not just to South Africa, this is to the whole world, the Human Rights Charter. So with that, reading that, then I understood that you can't provide the equality, the dignity, the safety, the shelter, and the healthcare without changing the policies. Because this is like an utopian world. This world doesn't exist. Then the project became very conceptual and metaphorical, because this world is the one, this Bill of Rights talks about a space that no other country can provide, because of you don't have a right in any other country, but we talk about you have the rights to these things. Then the project then took a different turn. Instead of producing an architecture, it looked at what architecture is like right now, architecture of refuge, where the women and children are in a dream state, because everything is just a dream. Whatever we wish for, it's going to remain a dream until these policies change globally. And then I mapped the route that the woman and child would take just to find a refuge, and then looking at the spaces that can provide that refuge, and then looking at what sort of navigations and where you would get that sort of assistance, and then how you could move around that space daily. And then I then took a different turn with the project, where I actually wanted to bring awareness to the concept of migrants. So I built this sculpture. It's a wire frame, and I made it out of wire because I wanted to reveal the invisibility of a migrant and a child. And the aim of that is that I can donate it to a park where it will grow, it will be colonized by plants, and then that reveals the nature of traveling, and also the nature of women being a fruit and life, because they give the nature, the kids. And then also looking at some installations that I can invade the city with, where I can change gates that have maps on finding refuge within the city. So I was starting to become like an activist more than immersing the architecture. Even changing the surface patterns of the city by creating information on how, but it's written in all the different languages. And this is only something that migrants, if you can know, read that language. And looking at how I can create some sort of emancipation, because I also have to think about the architecture as well, because mining in South Africa, the majority of migrants were men because of the mining industry. So most of the time, women were left behind. So the project seeks to emancipate women as well. And then I was looking at the empty site next to the shelter, and they have this terrace, and looking at how the space can become this helix where you can enter and exit as you please, but you find some sort of empowerment and sustainability, and sketching, making diagrams in terms of how there can be this production in a landscape, and it becomes this belt that brings you in and takes you out daily, in, out. And mapping the diagram and the movement in the space, and it felt like it wasn't enough for me, so I built these 1 in 20 models out of steel and concrete, so I can create an animation, to create the stop frame animation to make a movie, because architecture, most of the time, only architects can read. So it was important for me to make a movie that even anybody else can understand what the project is about. And then these models were meant to, like the light, so I can create the stage, and then I build and cut these installations to create that stage to shoot the movie. Can you please play?
government has dismissed claims by Joburg Mayor Herman Mashaba that it's dragging its feet in supporting his initiatives to address challenges of undocumented migrants. Government says it's a national issue and that the number of undocumented migrants is lower than documented ones. Mashaba discussed the issue with the Nigerian Consular General Godwin Adama today.
For some reason, it looks like the Minister of Home Affairs wants to plunge this country into chaos, abdicating his responsibility to ensure that we have the rule of law. But we will hold them accountable on behalf of you, on behalf of our foreign visitors.
The recent violent attacks on foreign nationals has affected the relations between South Africa and some of its northern neighbors.
We will build a great wall along the southern border.
After that project, I took a risk with it because mostly in architecture school is about the architecture, but I gave a taste of architecture because that's what we do to migrants. We give them a taste, a glimpse of what a space could be. So I wanted the project to be true to what the issues are. Then I collaborated with this lady, Nadia Tromp from Ntsika Architects, who does a project on migrants in France. And then we got invited to exhibit at the Venice Biennale, and we're looking at what could be the architecture of migrants in that space. She got excited by the idea of the blanket in terms of it's this only architecture of refuge that women can receive to hide within the law and also to navigate without being seen, but at the same time it provides the protection when you don't have a shelter. So this is what it's like, migrants standing outside a line in Home Affairs in Johannesburg. And then we're also interested by the migration situation that happens when migrants arrive in I think it's the shores of Italy and in Europe. And we looked at how we can actually combine these two themes of migrancy to create an installation in the Palazzo Mora Square. And then I built the sculpture, was walled in there, and then it has to be this blanket that you can sit inside and then experience what it's like hiding from something, but also at the same time, it creates this intimate space at the same time. So it provides a space for vulnerability and opportunity at the same time. And then we bought those files, and then we're getting excited about the project. So I was building this in my front yard, and we were cladding it with fiberglass, and that's it. And then we had to test it out. This is like a week before the Biennale, a day before we flew for the Biennale. And then cut it, box it, and then it arrived in Italy 5 days later because of, issues. And then they told us that we can't reinstall it ourselves, so we have to take it to a factory where they will install it for us because we don't have the rights. I think they're protecting their own, they're making money. It's a money-making scheme for me. And then there I am, I'm looking at my own sculpture. I can't even touch it. I just have to point, like, connect there and there. And they were connecting. And then it was a beautiful moment, like taking it across the boat. And then we had to put it there in the space. And then that's the view. And I'm going to play a short clip about the experience of the blanket.
My name is Nadia Trump from South Africa, and I'm here at the 16th Venice Biennale 2018. We've got an exhibition of our work, which is inside the Palazzo Mora, and then we also have a sculpture in the garden of the Palazzo Mora. The sculpture talks particularly to marginalized communities, looking at the migrant crisis within Europe, and then also looking at the migrant situation within South Africa. The sculpture is very tactile, reflects the European situation with the emergency blankets, and then the space created feels almost cocoon-like. So trying to juxtapose that feeling of alienation more with a feeling of inclusion or feeling at home. I collaborated with a young architect, Tebogo Ramatlo, and he created a stop frame animation video which looks at a woman and child traveling from the north of Africa all the way down to South Africa. So people can have a little bit of a better understanding from the point of view of a migrant, and trying to create a very immersive environment where one can experience the story of a migrant.
The movie itself, it's all about the dream. It's about a woman and child in a dream state with a blanket that follows them all around, and it changes their state of being. The blanket actually gives them this dream where architecture of migrants is possible, where women and children are included in society.
In 2015, we won a competition in Rome which was looking at the similar ideas of the migrant crisis and how to create empathy. So at the moment we're trying to further that project, where we're working together with journalists and other designers of all fields to see how we can create a platform for people to engage with the subject, and looking at different ways of storytelling.
So it raised a very important question, actually, facing outside the sculpture. Look at that sign, so it's time, space, and existence. And it's a very interesting theory about, especially the workshop that we're working on about Occupy housing and Occupy memory. And it makes me think that only within space and time that objects can occupy. And it only within that space and the existence of that object, then we can have a memory. And I didn't just leave the project just as something. I wanted it to be something active within the public, so I donated my book cover to the shelter. So they changed their logo from that, and then they were so happy and pleased. They said, this is something that represents their institution. And then I donated the sculpture to the park, Joubert Park. It's a central park within Johannesburg, and it's growing in a fruit and food garden, and then hopefully in a few years it will be colonized by the food. And then I took the students to the park, and I told them about the importance of actually urban agriculture as the immediate means of helping migrants at the moment, because they can't have housing, but they probably can have access to daily food, and then they could do these installations within that. And then they were looking at the existing state of the space, and even the guy who works at the Joubert Park came to address them about the importance of food security. And some of the students in the honors year are looking at how they can actually challenge migrancy by looking at designing towers for migrants, like tall sculptures. This student designed a building that from the ground you have to pass through a calabash. And the calabash becomes an internet cafe. That's where you learn about language, what is Johannesburg, where do you come from, how do you find rights and all this. So it's becoming a digital space within the realm of Johannesburg. And from the top, you identify yourself with a space that probably provides refuge. And this other student was looking at designing a space for refuge children only, because there is a lot of homeless kids in Johannesburg, and how these kids can actually be provided a building that only caters for children only. So kids can imagine every day what type of world they want to be in. Because it is a homeless shelter, so everything is temporary, but the philosophy behind it is that the older child takes care of the younger child. So children don't need to be adopted in this building. And with that, and then looking at another project about occupying houses is Fetus. It's a suburb close to the university. So the undergrad students went into the space, and we're looking at this bridge. So there's this bridge that takes you into that suburb. It's been left over and it's a bit run down. And then there's a mural done by 2610, Thorsten Declan Anna. And this mural now it's off, and this is what it used to look like. And now it looks like that because it keeps getting vandalized. People take the steel to the scrapyard, and it's falling. And now the students were interested in taking this, some memory of the life of Fetus, and putting it inside a building. And because this is what Fetus used to look like, and then right now you have like just these small shops around the corner. And then the students made this collage of artwork and some sort of idea of what is the memory of the space. And then another group which was interesting was looking at the concept of time, that we always name our buildings, but they actually become timeless. There's a very interesting quote by Rem Koolhaas that a building will have two lives, the life that the architect imagined and the different life after the architect has left the space, and those two lives are never the same. And these students were capturing a memory of Fetus, and when the public came to the exhibition, they were enjoying the space. They were sitting there because it reminded them of what it was like during the during apartheid times, where they could live and enjoy in a space. And then there were demolitions that happened. So the students collected objects that were thrown out from the site, and they made interesting poetry. And then there's a light shining up the object to talk about what would that remind them of. And then that's it.